While I was buckling our 5-year-old into her car seat, my phone buzzed against my hip. I finished clicking the last strap into place first, because that's the kind of father I am. The kind who finishes the job in front of him before he looks at anything else. Then I pulled out my phone and read the text from my wife. Moving to France with Jaime. I emptied our savings. Good luck paying rent. I looked up at my daughter's paint-covered hands, purple and green fingerprints smeared across her denim jacket from art class, and I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't panic and wasn't grief. It was something closer to confirmation. I typed back 4 words. Thanks for letting me know. Then I put the phone in the cup holder, closed the car door, and drove my daughter home like it was any other Tuesday. What my wife didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I'd been waiting for that text for exactly 11 weeks. And when she landed in Paris and checked the account she thought she'd just cleaned out, she was going to learn that I'd been 3 steps ahead of her the entire time. My name is Graham Foster. I'm 36 years old, and until that Tuesday in October, I was a risk analyst for a mid-sized insurance firm headquartered in downtown Denver, the kind of job where my entire professional life revolved around one skill: noticing patterns before other people noticed them, calculating the odds of bad things happening before they happened, and building contingencies so that when disaster struck, it never actually caught me by surprise. I'd spent 14 years getting paid to see catastrophe coming. I just never imagined I'd end up applying that skill to my own marriage. Before I tell you what happened in Paris, I need you to understand who I was before all of this, because the man I am now was built entirely out of the wreckage of the man I used to be. I grew up in Fort Collins, Colorado, the son of a high school shop teacher and a nurse, solidly middle class, the kind of household where you paid your bills on time and you didn't talk about money at the dinner table because talking about money was considered vulgar. My father died when I was 26, a heart attack in the garage while he was restoring an old Bronco he'd been fixing up for 15 years, and he left me the house I grew up in, paid off, along with a modest life insurance policy that I never touched, because touching it felt like admitting he was really gone. That house sat in my name and my name only for the entirety of my marriage, a detail that would matter more than I could have guessed on the day my wife decided to leave the country. I met Fiona Marsh at a friend's engagement party in the Highlands neighborhood of Denver 9 years ago. She was 27 then, working as an event coordinator for a boutique firm that specialized in weddings for Denver's country club crowd, and she had this way of talking about her work that made table linens and floral arrangements sound like high art. She wore her ambition openly, which I found refreshing after dating women who pretended not to want things. Fiona wanted things. She wanted a life that looked good from the outside, and for the first several years of our relationship, I thought that meant she wanted the same life I did. We got married 2 years later at a vineyard outside Palisade, on the western slope, because Fiona had fallen in love with the idea of a destination wedding without the destination actually being far from home. Our daughter Lily was born 14 months after that, and for a while, life was exactly what I'd pictured when I was a kid watching my own parents grow old together in that little house in Fort Collins. Steady, predictable, good. Before I get further into this, if you're the kind of person who appreciates a story that doesn't waste your time getting to the point, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because I've got a lot more twists coming and you don't want to miss the moment my wife's plan fell apart in real time on the tarmac at Charles de Gaulle. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and give this video a like if you've ever had someone underestimate exactly how much you were paying attention. Now, back to the story. The cracks started small, the way they always do, so small that if you're not trained to look for patterns, you talk yourself out of seeing them. Fiona's firm had expanded 3 years ago into what they called destination event planning, coordinating weddings, and corporate retreats for wealthy clients who wanted the paperwork done by an American company, but the ceremony held somewhere with better light and better wine. That expansion meant Fiona started traveling more, first to Napa and Sonoma, then to Tuscany for a wedding that took 11 days to plan on site, and eventually to the south of France, where a vineyard client near Aix-en-Provence became one of the firm's flagship venues. She came home from that first Provence trip with a different energy than I'd seen in years, talking about lavender fields and stone farmhouses with the same breathless enthusiasm she used to reserve for our own life together. And I told myself that was just Fiona being Fiona, falling in love with beautiful places the way she'd once fallen in love with me. It was around that time she started taking French lessons through an app on her phone, 3 nights a week after Lily went to bed, headphones in, door to the home office closed. When I asked her about it, she said it was for work, that half her clients now wanted a planner who could negotiate directly with vendors in Provence and Burgundy without an interpreter slowing things down. It made sense. It made enough sense that I didn't push. But risk analysis isn't about any single data point looking suspicious. It's about the accumulation, the way a dozen individually reasonable things start forming a shape when you step back far enough. The French lessons, the trips that got longer, The new perfume, something warmer and more expensive than the light citrus scent she'd worn since college. The phone that used to sit face up on the kitchen counter and now never left her hand, not even when she was cooking dinner with flour on her fingers. The name Jaime first entered my orbit 11 weeks before that text in the school pickup line. Though at the time I had no idea it belonged to a person who would eventually try to walk off with everything I'd spent a decade building. Fiona mentioned him twice in passing, the way you mention a coworker you don't think matters. Jaime handles the property side for the Provence venue, she said one night over dinner, barely looking up from her phone. Jaime again a week later, something about him negotiating a better rate with a caterer in X. I remember thinking his name sounded French even though she pronounced it the American way, and I remember thinking nothing else about it, because a wife mentioning a work contact isn't evidence of anything. What made me start paying real attention wasn't the name. It was the receipts. I handled our joint finances the way I handled everything else in my life, which is to say carefully and on a schedule. Every Sunday night after Lily went to bed, I sat down with our accounts, reconciled the credit card statements, checked the savings balance, made sure the mortgage and the utilities and Lily's preschool tuition were all accounted for. It was a habit I'd had since before we got married, something my father drilled into me as a kid, the idea that you always know exactly where your money is, because the moment you stop knowing is the moment someone or something takes it from you without your permission. 11 weeks before the text, on a Sunday night in late July, I found a charge on our joint credit card for a boutique hotel in the 8th arrondissement of Paris, 4 nights, back when Fiona had told me she was in Provence the entire trip working the venue for a wedding. I didn't confront her. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think a lot of people watching this would have marched into the bedroom that night and demanded an explanation, and maybe that's the right instinct for some marriages, but it wasn't the right instinct for mine. I've spent my entire career learning that when you tip your hand too early, you lose the ability to see how a situation actually unfolds. If Fiona knew I was watching, she'd get careful, and careful people are much harder to understand than people who think no one is looking. So instead of confronting her, I did what I do for a living. I started building a model. I pulled 3 months of statements and mapped every trip against what she'd told me about it. I noted the days her location services, still shared with me from an old family plan feature neither of us had bothered to turn off, showed her phone pinging from a district of Paris nowhere near the Provence venue. I started keeping a private folder backed up to a drive that lived in a safety deposit box at a Wells Fargo branch on Colorado Boulevard. Nowhere near our house, nowhere Fiona would ever think to look, and I called Preston Vance. Preston had been my father's attorney back in Fort Collins, and after Dad died, he'd handled the estate transfer for the house, which meant Preston already had every document proving the property was mine alone, inherited before marriage, never once retitled into both our names despite Fiona asking about it twice over the years, requests I'd deflected with some version of "we'll get to it," requests that suddenly looked very different in hindsight. I called Preston on a Wednesday afternoon from the parking garage at my office, and I laid out everything I'd found: the hotel charge, the location pings, the French lessons, the way Fiona had started looking at her phone like it was a lifeline. Preston, a 61-year-old man with the calm bedside manner of someone who has watched 1,000 marriages end and stopped being shocked by any of them, listened without interrupting and then asked me one question that changed the entire shape of what came next. He asked, "Graham, do you want to save this marriage, or do you want to protect your daughter?" I didn't have an answer that day. I had one 3 weeks later. The answer came from Lily herself, in the unguarded way 5-year-olds tell you the truth without knowing they're doing it. We were in the car, driving back from her gymnastics class, and out of nowhere she said, "Mommy said we might get to see the Eiffel Tower someday. Just me and her," and I said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," keeping my voice light while my hands went cold on the steering wheel, and she said, "And Jaime says he'll teach me French so I can talk to the ducks in the park," and I nearly missed our exit. My daughter had met this man. My daughter had spoken to him, had been told stories about him, had been fed a future that apparently didn't include me in it, all while I was sitting 3 feet away at the dinner table every night having no idea any of it was happening. That was the night I stopped hoping this was something smaller than it looked, and started preparing for what it actually was. Over the following weeks, I built what Preston called a clean exit strategy, though privately I thought of it more like an insurance policy, which felt appropriate given my profession. First, I opened a new account at a credit union 2 towns over, one that had never been linked to any of Fiona's devices or logins, and I began redirecting the automatic deposits from my bonus structure into it instead of our joint savings, a completely legal move given the bonus was tied to my individual performance and not community income under Colorado law, according to Preston. Second, I established a irrevocable trust for Lily's education, funded with a portion of the equity I'd built in the Fort Collins house, which I'd quietly begun renting out for the last 2 years as a source of passive income Fiona knew about only in the vaguest terms. Third, and this was the part that made my stomach twist even as I did it, I made sure the joint checking account, the one we used for groceries and the mortgage and the everyday transparency of a shared life, stayed exactly where it was, untouched, unprotected, sitting there with roughly $81,000 in it. I left it there on purpose. Preston called it bait. I called it a test I was terrified she'd pass, because passing it would mean the woman I'd married for better or worse was willing to walk away from her own daughter without so much as a conversation. She passed it on a Tuesday in October, 3 days after she told me she needed to fly to Provence for a 9-day site visit ahead of a spring wedding, a trip that had her leaving from Denver International on a Sunday, and, according to the itinerary she showed me on her phone, returning the following Tuesday. I drove her to the airport myself that Sunday morning, helped her wrestle her suitcase out of the trunk at the departure's curb, kissed her goodbye like a man who still believed in the life he was living, and drove home to spend the week being a single parent, which by that point I had gotten quietly, thoroughly good at. Lily and I made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. We watched the same animated movie about a lost puppy 4 nights in a row because she asked for it, and I couldn't say no to her voice when she asked for things. And every night after she fell asleep, I opened my laptop and watched the transaction history on that joint account like a man watching a storm system on radar, waiting to see which direction it would break. The first withdrawal hit on Thursday, a $12,000 transfer out to an account I didn't recognize, routed through an intermediary bank before it would eventually land somewhere international. The kind of move that looks careless to an amateur but is actually a fairly standard way to muddy a money trail if you don't want your soon-to-be ex-husband tracing it in one hop. I didn't stop it. I could have. I had the authority on that account to freeze it in under 10 minutes with one phone call to our bank. But Preston and I had already discussed this exact scenario, and his advice stuck with me. "Let her take it," he said. "Every dollar she moves is a dollar of evidence that she planned this, that this wasn't a spontaneous decision made in the fog of an affair, but a calculated financial extraction executed while she still legally shared a residence and a child with you. Every transfer is a nailgram. Let her hammer them in herself." By Sunday, the account was down to $4,000. By Monday, the day before she was supposed to fly home, it was empty. I sat in my kitchen that Monday night after Lily was asleep, looking at a balance of $0.11 in an account that had held $81,000 9 days earlier, and I felt strangely calm, the way I imagine a surgeon feels calm cutting into a body that a lesser-trained person would find horrifying to look at. I wasn't calm because I didn't care. I was calm because I had already grieved this marriage in installments, over 11 weeks, one piece of evidence at a time, and by the time the account hit zero, there was nothing left in me that was shocked. Tuesday morning came, the morning she was supposed to fly home from what I now understood had never been a work trip at all. I dropped Lily off at her preschool on Josephine Street in the Congress Park neighborhood, the same routine we'd had 100 times, and I was walking her into the building, both of us laughing about something her stuffed rabbit had supposedly said on the drive over, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I finished the drop-off first. I signed her in at the front desk. I knelt down and let her plant a paint-smudged kiss on my cheek, and only after she'd disappeared through the classroom door with her teacher did I pull out my phone in the parking lot and read the text that had been sitting there for 11 minutes. Moving to France with Jaime, I emptied our savings. Good luck paying rent. I stood in that parking lot for a long moment, not because I was in shock, but because I was doing the math one more time, confirming in my head that everything I'd built over the last 11 weeks was actually solid enough to hold the weight of what was about to happen. The mortgage was covered by the rental income from the Fort Collins house, which I'd never told her the true amount of. Lily's preschool tuition was on autopay from my individual checking account, the one Fiona had never had access to because I'd opened it before we got married and simply never merged it, a decision that had once felt slightly cold and now felt like the smartest thing I'd ever done. The house we lived in Washington Park, was rented, not owned, meaning there was no marital property fight waiting for me there. And the $81,000 sitting in a zero balance account was, in the grand scheme of what I'd actually protected, a decoy that had cost me nothing real. I typed back 4 words, "Thanks for letting me know." Then I drove to work, because Tuesday was Tuesday, and I had a 9 o'clock meeting about a claims model that didn't care whether my marriage had just ended over text message in a preschool parking lot. She landed at Charles de Gaulle Airport around 4 in the afternoon Denver time, which I knew because Preston had, at my request, kept a paralegal monitoring the flight status of the specific Air France route out of Denver that Fiona had booked months earlier under her own name, a booking Preston's office had actually flagged back in September once we started pulling records for the eventual filing. I imagine her walking through the terminal, jet-lagged and giddy with the particular high of a person who believes they've just outsmarted the man they married, pulling out her phone somewhere near baggage claim to check the account balance one more time to watch the number that represented her new life in France, the down payment on an apartment near the Marais that I would later learn Jaime had promised her, the seed money for whatever business venture the two of them had been whispering about over 11 weeks of stolen phone calls. I imagine her opening the banking app, and I imagine the exact moment her face changed, because Preston's office got a call from Fiona's own mother 40 minutes after that flight landed, and her mother relayed enough of the conversation that I got a fairly clear picture of how it went. The account showed $0.11, and underneath the transaction history visible to anyone with access to the account, which at that point was still both of us, was a note I'd attached to the final entry before I finally did freeze what was left. A habit from my job where every flagged transaction gets a memo. The note read, for the record, 2 words. I hadn't written them for her. I'd written them for the paper trail, for Preston, for the divorce filing I knew was coming. But I understood, sitting in my kitchen that night with Lily's crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator behind me, that those 2 words were going to land on Fiona like a verdict, because they told her, without a single wasted syllable, that I had known, not suspected, known, and that everything she'd done over the last 11 weeks, every secret transfer, every whispered call to Jaime, every lie about Provence, had been happening inside a house of glass she'd mistaken for a fortress. Her mother, Carol Marsh, called me that same night, her voice tight with an anger I could tell wasn't entirely aimed at me. Carol had never been the type to sugarcoat things, and she didn't start now. Graham, she said, Fiona is standing in an airport in Paris with 2 suitcases and about 300 euros to her name, and she is asking me to wire her money. And before I do that, I would like you to tell me what in God's name is going on. I told her. All of it. The hotel charge in July, the location pings, Lily's comment about the ducks in the park, the $12,000 transfer, the emptied account. Carol was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped into something quieter and more tired than anger. She said, I raised that girl better than this. And then she said something I've thought about many times since. She said, you're not going to hear this from her, Graham, but thank you for not letting our granddaughter grow up not knowing where she stands with her father. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said goodnight, and hung up and sat in the dark kitchen for a while longer before I went up to check on Lily, who was asleep with her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, completely unaware that her mother was 3,000 miles away, discovering exactly how much her new life was actually worth. Fiona called me the next morning, Paris time 7 hours ahead, meaning it was nearly 1 in the morning for her, her voice a mixture of panic and fury that I recognized from every argument we'd had in 9 years of marriage, except this time there was something underneath it I'd never heard before, something closer to fear. Where is the money, Graham? She said. No hello, no explanation for the text she'd sent 48 hours earlier, just the demand, sharp and immediate. I told her the truth because I'd promised myself I would, no matter how satisfying it might have felt to lie to her the way she'd been lying to me for months. I told her the $81,000 in that account had been the only money left in any joint account, that I'd moved the rest of my income into an individual account months ago, legally, that the house we lived in was rented, and the house that actually belonged to me had never once had her name on the deed, that Lily's education fund was in an irrevocable trust she had no claim to, and that as of that morning, Preston Vance had already filed for divorce on my behalf, citing abandonment and dissipation of marital assets, with a custody petition attached that included, among other exhibits, a timeline of her travel records against her stated whereabouts, and a transcript provided voluntarily by our 5-year-old daughter's preschool teacher of a conversation in which Lily had mentioned a man named Jaime who was going to teach her French. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Fiona said, in a voice much smaller than the one she'd started the call with, "You knew this whole time." I said yes. She asked how long, and I told her 11 weeks, and I heard her breath catch because I think some part of her had built a story in her head where I was the oblivious husband, the one who never saw it coming, the one whose life would simply implode the moment she was gone, and that story had just been replaced by a much less flattering one, where I had been watching her every move for nearly 3 months while she thought she was the one in control. What she told me next, in fragments over the following 20 minutes, painted a picture that I found almost sadder than the affair itself. Jaime Delacroix, 38, the property manager she'd met at the Provence venue, had told her he owned a share of the vineyard, that he had capital waiting for the right investment, that the two of them could start an event planning business together, catering exclusively to American clients who wanted authentic French weddings without the language barrier. He had told her all of this in a stone farmhouse with a view of lavender fields, and Fiona, 42 years old and apparently starving for a version of her life that felt bigger than school pickup lines and mortgage payments, had believed every word of it. What she discovered upon arriving in Paris, standing outside a rented studio apartment in the 18th arrondissement that was nowhere near as glamorous as Jaime's stories had led her to expect, was that Jaime did not own a share of anything. He worked for the vineyard on a contractor basis, the same as a dozen other local vendors, and the capital he'd talked about waiting to invest was, as far as Fiona could tell from the argument they had within hours of her landing, capital he was expecting her to provide from the very savings account she'd just emptied and I'd just frozen. When she told him the account showed zero, Jaime's warmth had evaporated with a speed that told her everything about what kind of investment she'd actually been to him. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing hearing all of this. There was a part of me, small and ungenerous, that felt something close to satisfaction, the particular vindication of watching a calculation prove itself correct. But there was a larger part of me that just felt tired. Tired in the way you feel after a long illness finally breaks. The fever gone, but the exhaustion still sitting heavy in your bones. I told Fiona I hoped she figured things out, and I meant it, not because I wanted her back, but because our daughter was going to spend the rest of her life being connected to whatever Fiona became next. And I had a vested interest in that being something better than a woman stranded in a foreign country by a man who'd never really wanted her, only what he thought she could provide him. The divorce proceedings took 4 months, which Preston told me was fast by Colorado standards, largely because Fiona, chastened and broke and staying on her mother's couch in Lakewood by the time she flew back from Paris 9 days after that first phone call, didn't have the resources or the will to fight the custody arrangement Preston had drafted. The court granted me primary physical custody, citing the abandonment, the financial records showing a deliberate emptying of joint assets, time to a planned international relocation, and a home study that found my daughter's daily routine, her preschool, her pediatrician, her extracurriculars had continued without interruption throughout the entire episode, while her mother's had been abandoned overnight for a man in another country. Fiona got standard visitation, supervised for the first 6 months at her own attorney's suggestion, unsupervised after that once it became clear she was actually showing up for the scheduled time and not disappearing again. I want to be fair here because this isn't a story about turning my daughter's mother into a cartoon villain for the rest of her life. Fiona made a catastrophic decision chasing a version of happiness that turned out to be a lie someone else told her, and she's been dealing with the consequences of that decision every single day since, in ways that are genuinely hard to watch even when you're the person she hurt. She moved back to Denver in December, into a small apartment in Aurora that her mother helped her afford, and she got her old job back at the events firm, though at a lower title than before, since 9 unexplained days of radio silence during a client trip does not exactly build professional trust. She sees Lily every other weekend now, and from what I can tell, she's trying, genuinely trying, to be present in a way that acknowledges what she almost threw away. Lily still asks about the ducks in the park sometimes, though these days it's less about a promised trip to France and more about the actual ducks at Washington Park, 3 blocks from the house I eventually bought outright with the equity I'd been quietly building, the house I finally, for the first time in my adult life, feel entirely settled in. I want to go back to that moment in the school parking lot because I think about it more than almost anything else from that entire year. I remember standing there with my phone in my hand, reading those words, moving to France with Jaime. I emptied our savings, good luck paying rent, and I remember the specific decision I made in that moment not to let my face change, not to let my hands shake, because I had a 9 o'clock meeting and a 5-year-old who needed picking up at 3:15, and a life that was, in every practical sense that mattered, already secure. I didn't feel like a man whose world had just collapsed. I felt like a man whose model had finally resolved, the way a risk calculation finally lands on a number after weeks of uncertain variables, and the strange gift of that feeling was that it left almost no room for panic. I had already done my grieving in installments, quietly, alone, over 11 weeks of Sunday night account reconciliations and silent phone calls to a lawyer in Fort Collins, and by the time the actual text arrived, there was nothing left to lose that I hadn't already accounted for. People ask me sometimes, usually after I've told a shortened version of this story at a dinner party, or to a new friend who eventually asks why I have full custody of my daughter, whether I regret not confronting Fiona the moment I found that hotel charge back in July, whether things would have gone differently, better, if I'd sat her down at the kitchen table and said I know, instead of letting the whole thing play out to its conclusion. I've thought about that question a lot, and I've landed somewhere I'm at peace with, even if it's not a comfortable answer. If I'd confronted her in July, I think Fiona would have done exactly what people do when they're caught early enough to still control the narrative. She would have cried and apologized and promised it was over, and I might have believed her, or wanted to believe her badly enough to pretend I did, and we would have spent the next year in a marriage held together by my own willful blindness, waiting for the next Jaime, the next Provence, the next quiet withdrawal from an account I'd stopped watching closely because I'd convinced myself the crisis had passed. By letting it play out, by watching instead of accusing, I got something I don't think I would have gotten any other way. I got certainty. I got to know, with total confidence, exactly who my daughter's mother was capable of being when she thought no one was paying attention. And I got to build a life around that knowledge instead of around a hope that might have been false. Lily is 6 now. She started kindergarten this fall at the elementary school 4 blocks from our house, and most mornings I walk her there myself, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her hands small and certain in mine. She doesn't remember much about that October anymore, or if she does, she's never said so, and I've been careful not to fill in gaps she hasn't asked me to fill. What she does know is that she has a dad who shows up every day, at pickup and at bedtime and at every school function, no matter how small, and she has a mom who is, slowly and imperfectly, trying to rebuild the kind of trust that doesn't come back overnight just because someone says they're sorry. I don't know what the next chapter of Fiona's story looks like. I know Jaime Delacroix is, as far as anyone has been able to confirm through the small, gossipy world of destination wedding vendors, still working the same property in Provence, still telling some version of the same story to whoever is willing to listen this season. I hope, for whatever it's worth, that Fiona finds something real eventually. Something that isn't built on a lie told in a stone farmhouse with a nice view. As for me, I've started dating again, carefully, slowly, the way you drive on a road you know has black ice somewhere, even if you can't see it. I met a woman named Hannah at, of all places, a parent orientation night at Lily's school, where she was there for her own son, a serious, funny kid named Owen who has somehow become Lily's best friend in the entire kindergarten class. Hannah teaches middle school science, has never once, in 6 months of knowing her, asked me a question about money that didn't feel completely ordinary, and laughs at exactly the kind of dry, understated jokes I make when I'm comfortable with someone, which is a rarer thing than I used to think. I'm not going to pretend I know where that goes. I've learned enough in the last year to know that certainty about the future is a luxury you don't get to have, no matter how many models you build or how many contingencies you plan for. What I do know is that I built a life that could survive the worst thing I thought could happen to it, and it did. And my daughter never spent a single night wondering where she was going to sleep or who was going to be there when she woke up. That's the part I want you to take away from this, more than the twist with the frozen account, or the phone call from Paris, or any of the details that probably brought you to this video in the first place. The lesson isn't really about outsmarting a cheating spouse, even though I understand why that part makes for a satisfying story. The lesson is that the people who love you the most, the ones who are actually paying attention, will notice the small things long before the big things happen, and what you do with that noticing is the entire measure of the person you turn out to be in the moment it matters most. I could have used everything I found out in July to destroy Fiona the moment I had the leverage to do it. I had the evidence, I had the lawyer, I had a case strong enough to make the divorce proceedings genuinely brutal if I'd wanted them to be. I chose instead to build a wall around my daughter's stability and let the truth do the rest of the work on its own. And I think that choice is the only reason Lily gets to grow up with two parents who, whatever else has happened between them, have never once made her the battlefield. Graham's story is the ultimate proof that reacting in anger isn't always the best move. It would have been so easy for him to blow up the second he saw that first hotel charge in July, but instead, he put his emotions aside and played the long game, not for revenge, but to build an absolute fortress around his daughter's stability. Because of that discipline, when the storm finally hit, Lily didn't feel a single drop of rain. It really makes you realize that the most powerful thing you can do in a crisis isn't to make noise. It's to quietly secure what actually matters. I've got to ask, would you have had the absolute ice in your veins to wait 11 weeks, or would you have confronted her on day one? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear your take. And if you're hooked on these stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and follow the channel. Appreciate you being here, and I'll see you in the next one.